A few months ago, my friend and I had a few small beers and watched Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. This was my sixth time watching the film. When I first watched it, I felt seen in a way that I can't quite put into words. Not just because of my feelings towards the film, but because I have a certain history that felt on display through this film.
Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, Hooterville Junction will no longer be so goddamn relevant.
The secret underground organizations of this film have been a fascination of mine for quite a while. The fascination started when I first watched Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Both shows had a way of taking ordinary institutions in life and giving them an interesting, cool twist that more often than not pertained to what a general audience would view as cool crime. This film is no stranger to that, and I would not be surprised if Paul Thomas Anderson took some notes from Vince Gilligan in writing this film. Then, to take that twist and give the character some morality in a fight against an evil form of nationalism just fuels me with such passion that I just had to relive this film again and again. I went to the locations this film was shot at so I could hope to regain some of these feelings of my first time viewing.
Glory to the newborn King, peace on earth.
Mexican hairless.
In September 2025, Paul Thomas Anderson gripped the box office by the neck and did not let go until his feature One Battle After Another had made its money back. It was the first Paul Thomas Anderson film to be a commercial success, making history. Nonetheless, the film is still an auteur piece at heart and sparked debate about what it really is about. Critics everywhere have claimed that nobody understood the film, while others have dismissed it as a mindless action film. I stand with the earlier column because, like the critics, I also did not truly understand the film until I began studying nationalism more closely. Nationalism is all over the subtext in the actual text of the film script. Despite being a pseudo-commercial action film, One Battle After Another explores nationalism by investigating it in different forms like revolutionary nationalism, white nationalism, primordialist nationalism, and gendered nationalism. In the end, the film has created a Bible of sorts of reference for all Americans who want to understand their place in the politically charged world of demographics. This film does not take a stance on any social matters per se. Instead, it depicts very real situations just as they were unfolding under the Trump administration, with ICE officers as key antagonists in a film that came out while Trump was unleashing ICE on the country. It may be coincidence, but it speaks to the essence of the film that the president tweeted about a tariff on all films that very same September. Of course, the film was well into the production before Trump's second term began, but it could not have come at a better time. The film begins with a 30-minute prologue depicting the French 75, the rebel group, the protagonists are in, performing treasonous terrorism in the name of an equal and free country. Here we see both gendered nationalism and revolutionary nationalism, and the two almost intertwine. The revolutionary nationalism can boil down all the way down to the name of the rebel group, the French 75.
One way of reading the French 75 is in reference to a drink, the drink was named after a gun of 75 millimeters. In French, it just means 75. So you get this kind of idea of a drunk militancy. A revolution is a sort of drunk militancy, a very sexy, change the world in one fell swoop sort of idea. And so in the whole film, you have illegal immigrants being funneled out of the thing, and that's kind of the real revolution. But what's going on the side is this drunken militancy. It's almost a commentary on what revolution really is. It's completely banal. It doesn't really apply to exactly what changing the world or anything like that. So in that way, it's a lot more in line with Paul Thomas Anderson's earlier work.
Life, man, life. Get off the phone. Get off the phone right now. I'm not on the phone, man.
Which draws parallels to the French Revolution. Key insights can be made from the type of revolution they are appealing to. They free immigration deportees, much like the storming of the Bastille led to the freedom of the prisoners within the dungeons. The French 75 also rob a bank, which results in the shooting of a black security guard by Perfidia Beverly Hills. This highlights the messiness of revolution and how innocents can be killed, innocents that they're supposed to be fighting for. By the end of the French Revolution, King Louis XVI's head was mounted on a spike next to his living son while the masses chanted, "Kiss Papa, kiss Papa." Nevertheless, the French Revolution was the first time the masses or mass nationalism collectively entered world history. This was a form of collectivist nationalism where the individual rights of others were ruled inconsequential next to the, as Rousseau puts it, the general will of the nation. Sieyès proclaimed that the third estate was the estate claimed by the common people, was the nation. This all comes at a time of enlightenment when rights were becoming at the top of people's minds. The name the French 75 evokes some form of French revolutionary nationalism that not only came from the French Revolution, but also in cinematic terms, the French New Wave. The French New Wave was revolutionizing cinema by conceiving of a meta, relaxed, more lifelike conception of how films were made. Ahead of this frontier was Jean-Luc Godard. Bordwell writes about the subjectization of the image in a film that is commonly made through mirrors. This is apparent in Godard's Breathless. Leonardo DiCaprio also had a pretty iconic mirror scene in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It is through this continuity that we identify the influence of French Revolutionary nationalism in cinema. For DiCaprio is playing a pretty similar role in One Battle After Another and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He is in both films as a bit of a washed-up loser who is trying to relive his glory days in a way. One Battle After Another is in itself a mirror scene, but it is reflecting nationalism in America. Metz talks about this when he says, this film is like the mirror, but it differs from the primordial mirror in one essential point. Although, as in the latter, everything may come to be projected. There is one thing and one thing only that is never reflected in it. The spectator's own body in a certain emplacement. The mirror suddenly becomes clear glass.
His name is Jungle Pussy.
Good chew.
The character of Perfidia Beverly Hills represents gendered nationalism in a lot of ways, but most importantly in how she is identified as a reproducer of a nation. Yuval Davis writes a pretty compelling piece that identifies examples of nations trying to regulate reproduction to produce a more successful form of nationalism. This is an example of how nationalism can be gendered. Davis writes, the country in which today population policies are formulated in the strongest eugenistic terms is Singapore, where Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew demanded that highly educated women as their patriotic duty should produce children who would be genetically superior, while poor, uneducated women were given cash reward of $10,000 if they agreed to be sterilized rather than continue to produce their genetically inferior children. She goes on to write that they attempted to do the same thing in Kansas. She writes, Tamara Lewin, for example, cites a plan in Kansas to pay welfare mothers $500 plus $50 a year for having Norplant patches containing a low-term, slow-release chemical contraceptives implanted in them. So to call back to how the revolutionary and gender nationalism is intertwined, Perfidia giving birth to a mixed baby as African Americans are a product of colonialism is in itself revolutionary. The integral nationalism of Hitler and Mussolini is vastly on display in the white Christian nationalism group in this film, the Christmas Adventurers.
That the white Christian nationalist movement does very well is to create a kind of satirical, ironic meme culture that is intended to be funny, that works to disguise, that works to as a kind of humorous veil that hides the really serious danger of white Christian nationalism. And so, when you hear white Christian nationalism, the way in which white Christian nationalism is presented, Pepe the Frog a few years ago, like a decade ago, was, I think, a key example of this. You think, oh, that's just sort of funny, right? That's just sort of like, tongue-in-cheek satire. Oh, that's just, it's not meant to be serious. It's meant to be ironic. And so there's a way of creating an illusion or a kind of separation from the underlying seriousness and danger, which I think is very, very real. So I think the humor is actually a tactical masquerade, and that the threat is very real, on the ground, organized, and at the highest levels of power in this administration. I think the threat is real, and I think the humor is simply there to galvanize support, specifically amongst young male gamers, and which has been really successful at doing that. I think the underlying threat, the underlying message, and the underlying policies attached to white Christian ideologies is deadly serious. Just ask any undocumented person in this country, including DACA kids. I think they understand the seriousness.
The character of Willa embodies primordial nationalism. Primordial nationalism is a belief that nationalism is based on certain ethnic features. The key difference between primordial nationalism and, say, ethno-symbolist nationalism is that ethno-symbolists ask for more like language and symbols of nationalism to define their nationalism. However, both hearken from the same ethnic components that inscribe nationalism. This is a very interesting debate between Ernest Gellner and his student Anthony D. Smith called the Warwick debates. Anthony D. Smith says the concept of the nation refers to a particular kind of social and cultural community, a territorial community of shared history and culture. Gellner argues with a metaphor. He asks the question, do nations have navels? For Gellner, nationalism is about modernity and the invention of systems for proliferating nationalism, like the printing press and modern institutions to found nationalism. Willa and her mother before her harken back to the base form of nationalism. The complexity of colonialism and nationalism is elaborated on sinners. The main antagonist is Irish, Ireland being a country strived with colonialism, and the main protagonists are black, with the film having rich themes of black ownership in the South. The film is so much about black ownership that the director Ryan Coogler negotiated a deal that he will own it in a few years. Here and in One Battle After Another, we see colonialism in question. The themes don't end there. Eric Ross's essay on One Battle After Another identifies a correlation between Willa's age and the Obama administration. That being said, she was conceived when Obama was in office. There was a lot of hope that went along with that. A man whose ancestors are a product of colonialism takes office, and in 16 years, the hope that he brought to the country has all but dissipated.
African Americans, or so-called Negro. One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America.
Yeah, when I read the Ballad on the Bullet speech, and that was from 1964, I see that as, or I guess the way in which I was looking at that speech in our course last quarter was to see it as part of a much wider, a much larger, global anti-colonial nationalist struggle, against the forces of colonialism. And I think when you read Malcolm X's The Ballad or the Bullet, it is similar to the kind of nationalism that you see in Algeria in the anti-colonial struggle against the French during sort of the same time period. It's similar to anti-colonial nationalisms around the world at that time period in the 1960s.
All of America's preachments today. In the United Nations, you have poor nations and rich nations. They say that the most powerful bloc in the UN are the African Asian bloc. These are the poor nations. Yet they carry more weight in this political body than the nations do who have all the money. Why? Because no matter how wealthy America is, she only has one vote. No matter how wealthy Russia is, she only has one vote. Whereas all the poor nations in Africa who have just emerged into independence, they have each a vote too. And they stick together and are able to outmaneuver the rich nations. This is by having independence and the right to vote in the political world body, it has enabled the dark nations to band together and use the strength of their ballot to force the wealthy nations, which are the white nations, into giving more independence to other nations who are still under their jurisdiction. You and I have to look at this and understand this, that the ballot is as powerful as the bullet.